And recording is started, so I will start with welcoming karakia to everyone. Maori oha, Maori tu, Maori ora kia tātou, haumie, huie, tai kia. So welcome to everyone. We are opening this very interesting session today. With our guests from OCLC Research team from US. We have Dr. Richard Urban, we have Dr. Brian Lavoie, and Merrilee Proffitt based in California today. So this is a follow-up session from the first OCLC webinar we had from our guests Tisha and Rebecca, as well from Florida, I believe. And this will be an interesting opportunity to hear research updates from based on the work of Dr. Richard and Brian as well. I would just like to say hello to our audience who have joined us today from Australia, and we do expect few visitors from US as well, because we know OCLC has opened this session and promoted it as well through their channels. So if you're coming from outside of New Zealand, we warmly welcome you, and we hope that you will enjoy this session as well as our audience too. So the way it's going to be is that Merrilee will introduce our guest speakers because she knows them much better than we do, and their topics, and we will open the chat room for any questions you may have as we go along, and we will address them after each presentation at the end. So there will be plenty of time for discussion, for your questions, and I believe our guests today have prepared some questions for you as well to answer. So we hope this will be quite interesting and engaging session for all of us, for all of you too. So welcome, Merrilee, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go ahead and share my screen here so that you can see some slides along with us. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever in the world you are from. I am Merrilee Proffitt, Senior Manager for the OCLC Research Library Partnership, and so glad to have so many of you with us from across the globe, but especially from New Zealand. And thank you for welcoming us onto your land. We would like to acknowledge and celebrate the Indigenous peoples from where we are, from our perspective. We are on a variety of lands here in the United States and want to pay tribute and acknowledge and celebrate both past and as well as present leaders of these communities. I am speaking to you from Oakland, California, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Chochenyo-Alani people. So thank you so much for welcoming us. We are, of course, based in, we are OCLC, we are OCLC Research. OCLC Research is rather an unusual organization. I don't think that there's any like it elsewhere in the world. We are, of course, part of the OCLC organization. OCLC has been around since 1967, but OCLC Research has been a very special part of OCLC since 1978. So we have very deep roots, and our mission is to accelerate and scale library learning, innovation, and collaboration. And we do this in many different ways, but we are an organization that is devoted exclusively to the challenges that are facing libraries and archives today. As I mentioned, I am based within the OCLC Research Library Partnership. This is a transnational network of research libraries. There are 125 institutions globally. Currently, much of the work in OCLC is based within the OCLC Research Library Partnership. We use this as a way to, as a test bed for our research. So for those of you who are at institutions that are currently engaged in the OCLC RLP, I want to thank you for your continued support. For those of you who are interested in learning more about our work, I'll put a link into chat later, and you can find out all about it. This is, an important way that we connect with community across research libraries. I also want to, as Netta said, this is a throwback. We last gave an update on the turn to open that was given by my colleague, Rebecca Bryant and Titia van der Werf. We're hoping with LIANZA colleagues to make this maybe a twice a year update research coming out of OCLC Research. So hope to come to you for more topics from today, but it is my pleasure first to introduce to you my colleague, Brian Lavoie, who is based in Dublin, Ohio. He works out of OCLC's headquarters in Central Ohio in the US. Brian and I have been colleagues for, I think, about 22 years now. Brian is just a delightful colleague to have, thoughtful, funny, and Brian is very well known for all of his research having to do with looking at collections and the movement of collections and collecting patterns. That's really a hallmark of his research, but also looking at collaboration and potential for collaboration. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Brian for this first part of the presentation.
Oh, thank you, Merrilee. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks to all of you for the opportunity to talk to you today and to share some of our work with you. Go ahead and next slide. Yeah. Before I get to the report that I'm supposed to be talking about, I thought I'd mention some work that I did a while ago on the New Zealand national presence in the published record. So this is work where we used OCLC's WorldCat database, which is the world's largest and most comprehensive registry of library collections, to identify and characterize New Zealand's contribution to the published record, or as we call it, its national presence in the published record. And by this, we mean materials published in New Zealand, materials authored by people from New Zealand, and materials about New Zealand. So we've done national presence studies for Scotland, for Ireland, for Canada, and as you see, for New Zealand. So we thought we might begin by testing your knowledge of the New Zealand presence in the published record with a question. So go ahead, Merrilee. So here you go. Who is the most popular New Zealand-born author as measured by total global library holdings? You can put your answers in the chat if you think you know. No fair downloading the report and looking it up. I think I've stumped everyone. I'm not seeing a lot of answers. No guesses? Okay. Catherine Mansfield, Margaret Mahi. All right. Well, go ahead, Merrilee. The correct answer is indeed Margaret Mahi. So according to our WorldCat data, Margaret Mahi, who's the prize-winning children's author, is the most popular New Zealand author, again, as measured by total global library holdings. Incidentally, second place belongs to Joy Cowley, who's another well-known children's writer. And third place goes to mystery writer Ngaio Marsh, who I understand is considered one of the 4 original queens of crime, along with Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, and Marjorie Allingham. So there you are. All right, on to the business at hand. So I'm going to share an overview of a new OCLC research report that was published a few months ago. It's all about multi-institutional library collaboration, which is important to know, but I've also flagged a couple of words in the title that are good to keep in mind while you listen, and that's strategic choice. So I'll be touching on that concept quite a bit in my discussion. So I'll give you a tour of what's in the report, and along the way, I'll try to make a case why this topic is important to libraries. Okay? I'll start with a quote to help motivate the origins of the project and why we thought it was important to do. It's from Valerie Horton, who's a longtime executive director of library consortia. And she's basically saying that collaboration is a deeply rooted tradition in the library community as a way of getting things done, of organizing capacities to fulfill the library mission. And really, when you talk to librarians about collaboration, you often hear something to the effect that collaboration is really part of our professional DNA. And to sort of support that view, I mean, just think about LIANZA's communities and special interest groups, like the one sponsoring this webinar, where members use LIANZA as a platform to connect and to get things done. So this is just to underscore that collaboration is very important to libraries. And because of that, it's good to understand as much as we can about it and how we can maximize its chances for success. Okay. But I want to offer a couple of other quotes for you to consider. Both are from my colleague, Lorcan Dempsey, who wrote about library collaboration recently. And I think he made a couple of really good points. First, that collaboration can release significant benefits, but usually those benefits don't come for free. As Lorcan says, collaboration is very hard and effective collaboration is even harder. So in other words, to make collaboration work, to make it successful, you need to invest time, effort, and resources into it. And then extending this thought that collaboration requires investment, Lorcan went on to observe that it's an investment that requires careful consideration. As he puts it, what libraries need is not just but collaboration. In other words, one that's based on active, informed decision-making about what activities should be done locally and be scaled, or to put more succinctly, okay.
Hello, Brian. It seems that we have lost you. You're breaking up a little bit, and I do wonder maybe it's a connection at this stage. So I will just
Can
wait.
you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's hope that my internet holds up. All right, so it's these observations from Lorcan that really were the jumping off point for this project. So the goals were to help libraries make good decisions about collaboration, help them choose effective forms of collaboration, and help library leaders communicate decisions involving collaboration to staff and to other stakeholders. So with these goals in mind, the report produced insights
Okay, we are losing you.
That are around 3 major outcomes, which are listed there on the slides. What is a minute now? Any problems on my end? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. All good.
It might help if you turn the camera. Sorry, Brian. I was just thinking, it might help if you turn the camera off, but still have the screen share. Yeah. If that might help with the balance.
Okay, let me try that.
Thank you.
And see if that helps. Okay. All right, go ahead, Merrilee. I just wanted to acknowledge the advice and support of a wonderful project advisory committee whose contributions really shaped and strengthened the ideas in the report, and just want to thank them for their involvement in the work. Okay. So every organization has to select the right mix of sourcing strategies to acquire the capacities it needs to carry out its operations. By sourcing strategy, I mean the way an organization chooses to acquire capacity, like services, like expertise they need, like infrastructure. So the report starts by introducing a model that describes 4 basic sourcing strategies for libraries. The first is build, which is developing and deploying capacity through your own internal efforts. Collaborate, which is working with other organizations to collectively create capacity that is shared. And then outsource, which is contracting with an external provider who will supply the capacity for you. And I should point out that, as the model indicates, collaboration and outsourcing can be done with different kinds of partners and providers. And then the last strategy there is refer, which is where you direct users to an external provider for some capacity, but there's no contractual relationship between your organization and the organization providing the capacity. Now, I'm guessing that the first 3 strategies are already pretty familiar to you. The last one, refer, might benefit from some explanation. So think of an academic library, for example, that needs data repository services. So even if they don't build those services, even if they don't collaborate to get them or buy them from someone, they can still gain access to those services by referring researchers to open disciplinary repositories like Dryad, for example, and recommending that they use those. So there's no relationship between the library and the repository. The only link is really the referral, which might be something through something like a LibGuide. And I think the refer strategy as a sourcing choice sometimes gets overlooked in discussions. Now, there's a few other details in the model that I'm going to skip over because of time constraints, but I think the big takeaway here is that these are all legitimate sourcing choices for a library. There's no preference ranking inherent in the picture. None of these options are better than the others, although one might be more suitable for a particular set of circumstances. And we can point to examples of different institutions making different choices for different reasons among these options, depending on their priorities. So what we want to do with this model is just highlight the fact that collaboration is one choice among several, and if it's selected, it should be selected as a result of a strategic choice that evaluates the pros and cons of alternative sourcing options, okay? So how do you choose the right sourcing strategy? Here's a quote from the operations strategy literature, which I think sums the problem up nicely. Basically, you need to match your institutional priorities to the best methods or operational structure, as they call them, for achieving them. So it's just simply, you need to match means to ends. There's an important corollary to this. When you think about all the characteristics you'd like your sourcing strategy to reflect, often some of those characteristics will be at odds with one another. So for example, you might want your sourcing strategy to really emphasize speed and innovation, but that could be incompatible with also emphasizing risk mitigation. You can't have everything in your sourcing strategy. That's really the big point there. So ultimately, in choosing a sourcing strategy, you need to prioritize the features that are the most important to your organization, and then manage the trade-offs that are inevitably going to follow. And that's a huge part of what we mean when we say that selecting a sourcing strategy like collaboration, that needs to be a strategic choice, okay? So with this idea of managing trade-offs in mind, the report supplies a checklist of considerations that can be used to evaluate the characteristics of different sourcing strategies and how they line up against your institutional priorities. And the idea underpinning the checklist is that you can't optimize everything in one strategy. So you might choose or have one strategy, say collaboration, and that has a particular bundle of characteristics. And then you have another strategy like, say, outsource, and that has a different bundle of characteristics. And your goal is to figure out which bundle better aligns with your overall institutional priorities, matching means with ends, as I mentioned before. While at the same time recognizing that by choosing one of those bundles, you're implicitly giving up some of the advantages or benefits that are inherent in the other bundle. So in other words, you're managing trade-offs. So the checklist has 16 considerations that are organized into 5 thematic clusters, which are there on the right. And each cluster represents a different facet of a candidate sourcing strategy that can be described and evaluated. And it's our view that walking through this checklist will help libraries form a general description of each strategy's key features and potential trade-offs. And you can then compare those to what you want to prioritize as an institution and determine what's the best fit. And I think this checklist also could be an important tool for communicating sourcing choices to stakeholders. Okay. And this is just a sample of what the checklist looks like. These are some of the considerations that we've grouped under a category focused on the characteristics of how the process of the sourcing strategy unfolds. So here it's questions like, is it flexible as conditions change? How quickly can you deploy it? How much of your local decision-making autonomy do you need to give up to use this strategy? And then ultimately, how do the answers to these questions align with what you want to prioritize as with your institution? So the checklist really expands on the sourcing strategies model we looked at a few slides ago by providing a tool that can help define the features of each of those options and highlight the differences, the trade-offs between them, as part of a process of choosing between them. And we actually heard from a couple of people who reviewed a draft version of this report that this checklist might be the most important part of what the report offers. And that suggests that, you know, a gap in some of the decision-making that goes on in terms of choosing among sourcing alternatives and when you look at libraries today. Okay. So the last part of the report focuses on the collaboration option itself. And the idea here is that because collaboration pops up as a topic in all sorts of contexts and activities, it's received a lot of attention in the scholarly literature, in particular the economics literature. So there's this rich resource of scholarly insight on collaboration that can be, you know, really readily applied across many contexts, including libraries. So libraries can learn a good deal about collaboration by dipping in to this insight. So what we did was we picked 4 economic concepts and we explored how the insights from the literature on them could deepen our understanding of what factors impact the prospects for successful, sustainable collaboration. And we call these topics strategic frames. And one way to look at them is that each frame is like a different window or a filter through which you can look at the collaboration decision, with each window focusing on a different aspect of that decision. So really quickly, you know, collective action focuses on the coordination of collective efforts within a group. Think of issues like assembling the right mix of partners, establishing trust and commitments across those partners, and incentivizing them in ways that draw out sufficient effort to achieve, you know, whatever your mutual goals are. Transaction costs focuses on minimizing the costs of collaboration. Think of issues like the effort involved in identifying and convening a group of institutions to collaborate with, the effort in achieving consensus on methods and goals, and the staff time that's needed to participate fully in the collaboration as it moves forward. Path dependency focuses on changing directions toward a collaborative approach. Here we're talking about issues like convincing senior administrators that joining a new library collaboration is the right way to acquire some capacity that you need. So are there significant costs in moving from, say, a vendor supplied system to a collaboratively sourced system? Or alternatively, what are the costs of sticking with the status quo as opposed to pursuing collaboration as a new sourcing strategy? And then lastly, the principal agent problem. This is really all about decision-making control. Think about issues like choosing governance arrangements for a collaborative activity. Is it going to be run by a committee of members? Or will the decision-making authority be delegated to a centralized executive? What kinds of oversight mechanisms are needed to ensure executive decisions align with the interests of the membership? All of that falls under the principal agent problem. Okay. So what we ended up doing is translating the important ideas from each of these areas into a tool that library decision makers can use to support the discussion of collaboration opportunities. So for example, on the slide, this is just part of the tool that's focused on that principal agent problem I mentioned. On the left side, there's an enumeration of the key concepts and insights attached to that frame. And then on the right side, there's a series of what we call prompts to action connected to those insights. Really kind of questions that libraries can ask themselves to form a more complete view of the obstacles that could stand in the way of a successful collaboration, and then hopefully what can be done to overcome them. And this could be whether we're talking about a new collaboration just getting underway or one that's been underway for some time. And I think this is a fairly unique approach to talking about library collaboration by using insights from the non-library literature. And again, the goal is just to deepen our understanding of what makes collaboration sustainable and successful. Okay. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground really quickly. I just want to give you a big picture view of how it all fits together. So I said at the beginning of the talk that there's three major outcomes in the report. The first, the sourcing strategy model, it's a way to enumerate the basic sourcing options open to libraries as they acquire new capacities. And along with that, it contextualizes collaboration as one option among several. And this highlights the fact that in most circumstances, collaboration needs to be a strategic choice. The second outcome is insight and a tool, the checklist we discussed, that we hope will support libraries as they make that strategic choice to help them understand the pros and cons of different sourcing options, including collaboration, and make the choice that best fits their needs. And then the third outcome is more insight and another tool, the one we just looked at, that focuses on one particular choice, collaboration. And we hope libraries can use this to talk through the features of a collaborative opportunity or an existing collaboration and identify potential obstacles to success and then hopefully strategies for overcoming them. Now, I think that a lot of what I've discussed with you today may be familiar to you in one form or another as part of your experience working in libraries, but I think it's important to bring these ideas together and supplement them with tools that can help surface them more explicitly in things like strategic planning exercises, decision-making processes involving capacity acquisition, internal reviews of existing collaborations, and also for communicating sourcing decisions and issues to staff and other stakeholders involved. Okay. Let me finish with just a quick word on next steps. This is actually a two-part project. The report we discussed today was part one. The second part will take the outcomes from the first report and apply them to a set of case studies, all of which focus on examples of groups of academic libraries acting collaboratively to acquire research data management capacity. So in each case, we're taking the insights from the first report and seeing how they play out in real world examples of library collaboration. So we're working on that report now, so stay tuned for more on that in the near future. Okay, I will leave it there. I'd like to thank you again for having the opportunity to share this work with you, and I look forward to any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you, Brian, for speaking to us from off camera there and managing the connection issues. I want to welcome all of you to please put questions, observations, comments into the chat. We'll have some time at the end. But next up, I want to welcome my relatively new colleague, Richard Urban, at the other end of the spectrum. So I've worked with Brian for over 2 decades now. I can't believe it. Richard joined us in August of this year, and it really seems like much longer that we've been working together because he's just such a wonderful addition to our team. Richard has a very quite a varied background working in museum contexts, looking at metadata in a wide variety of applications. He's been a professor in library school studies, so he has that background as well. And Richard is helping us to make sense of our metadata engagement within the OCLC Research Library Partnership and OCLC Research and OCLC Research more generally. So Richard, I'm going to let you take it away to summarize a couple of recent outputs from OCLC Research.
Yeah, and so as the new person on the team, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight are outputs and outcomes from work that my other colleagues at OCLC Research have been undertaking. But before I get into that, if we want to go to the next slide. I am fortunate to be working from Corning, New York. And for those of you that don't have a good grasp of United States geography, we're about halfway between New York City and Niagara Falls. And that's located on the unceded seas territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, of which the Onondaga and the Gayakono are a part. And you may know those better as the Seneca and Cayuga nations. I acknowledge the oppressive history inflicted upon and continued dispossession of the Haudenosaunee people and honor their ongoing connection to these lands and waters. Next. So the main area that I'm going to be working in within the Research Library Partnership is next generation metadata. And the shoulders that I'm standing on belong to Karen Smith Yoshimura, who has led for many years something called the Metadata Managers Group that's part of the RLP. This is a group of about 100 people who don't necessarily manage metadata directly, but have responsibility for managing staff who do manage metadata. And part of the conversations that group has led us through is talking about where we go next and what does this transition to linked data look like in the future of libraries. Of course, part of that transition is moving away from sort of MARC-like record structures to things like linked data. And that then comes along with the requirement to have persistent identifiers for the things that we're talking about. A lot of this is also about special and unique collections where the information is not coming from copy cataloged records or from national libraries, but it's metadata that's coming from us, whether or not those are special collections or if we think about creating metadata for the research output for our faculty. It means moving towards metadata as a service as we think of taking our records and pulling them apart in different ways, and how do we put them back together in ways that we can use within our discovery systems. And this, of course, has all kinds of implications for how we staff these positions and what we need to be doing to train the next generation of librarians. Can we go to the next slide, please? Since that report came out in 2019, of course, we've been doing a lot of other work. You had a chance to talk with Rebecca Bryant, who's been doing a lot of work around research information management. Again, that's a core part of where these inside-out collections are coming. She's also been working around the topic of social interoperability. So how is it that we collaborate with each other, as Brian was talking about? It's also part of that is interoperating with people in collaborations. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about an example project about how do we actually transform data that we have into linked data, and some other work that Merrilee has been leading called Reimagined Descriptive Workflows. Next, please. Of course, the other thing that happened is that COVID happened to us all, and in many ways that accelerated some of the shifts that we were already seeing. Universities shut down, people went home, use of electronic resources went up. We had to find new ways to connect people with the things that they needed. Next. In talking to the metadata managers, we asked them some questions, or these are questions they also came up with themselves of, well, why is metadata changing? If we look at the people question, traditional metadata was made by librarians, and we use rules that really only librarians understood. The processes we follow often have limited focused coverage. just on bibliographic materials and has excluded things like other parts of the scholarly record in articles and data sets or other kinds of research information management. Some of it is very labor intensive and expensive to produce and maintain, and that's not necessarily helped with the record-centered platforms that we have, limitations of the historic legacy of MARC record formats that also make it hard to manage corrections, enhancements, or augmentation of those records, and it doesn't necessarily scale to the current state of digital change. Next, please. So in short, our metadata could be better. There's not enough of it. And the metadata that does exist is not necessarily used widely outside of the library domain. Next. So one of the things that we need to be doing is thinking about how we transition to people. New generations of librarians lack some of the deep know-how that traditional catalogers have. But at the same time that we're trying to teach them those skills, we're looking forward to next generation of metadatas. But that's still very fluid, so we don't really necessarily know what the competencies are needed to move into that area yet. So there's a lot of learning by doing, which also is not necessarily very efficient or effective. So one of the other things that we need to think about is how do we measure the quality of what we're doing while we're trying to learn new ways of doing things? Next, please. In part, and I think this might be a little bit more in a North American context, because I feel like over the course of my career, one of the places that I have looked for leadership in areas of recognizing Indigenous people has been New Zealand and Australia and other places. So some of this may be not new to you, but I think it's been much more of a focus in the United States, particularly since 2016 and forward. The Reimagined Descriptive Workflows is a report that we have published, and as much of this is some really useful feedback and guidance about this, I would recommend taking a look at the website for the report, which we can put into the chat a little bit later. Again, Merrilee has been deeply involved in this work and I think has some really good longer form videos about the process by which this report was created in the first place. So one of the things that we need to do as we're looking at transforming the technical side of our metadata is also think about the ethical and responsive nature of the metadata. We need to find better ways to engage our communities in descriptive practices and finding opportunities in new technical and platforms to make the speed at which our metadata can adapt more quick. Linked data may be part of that, but it's also about streamlining and automating other kinds of routine metadata workflows to allow us to focus on some of this other work which hasn't been done in the past. Next, please. In the report, you'll find that there are three main areas. So partly is the organizational shifts. Changes need to happen at the institutional and organizational level. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. And restructuring priorities. I saw a comment on a group that I'm part of recently that referenced this report. And of course, the immediate response was, well, that's great. We'd love to be able to do that. But, you know, our administration is got us on a clock and like, how many records can we produce? And I don't have time to go back and remediate old records and do these kinds of things. So this change isn't just at the cataloger level or how I make descriptions, it's at the leadership level at my library, my metadata manager, and also all the way up to the larger parts of my institution to understand why maybe the cost of creating certain kinds of metadata may be different than it was in the past, if that's what we're focused on, because we're doing this work to remediate and make the metadata better and more responsive to our communities. Again, this may also require thinking about our day-to-day practice and how do we need to change our workflows and policies around how we create this data. Is there funding and support for the work, but at all different levels of the organization? And of course, this all does come down eventually to the individual, and we need to invest in the education, and not just the technical education of how do I do this differently, but having people shift their frame of thinking about the problems so that everyone in the organization, regardless of their role, can participate in making our metadata more responsive. Next, please. And as I said earlier, not only have I often looked to New Zealand as a place to provide guidance and thinking about it, particularly I have a long history in working in cultural heritage metadata and in museums, but Merrilee and the other collaborative that put this report together also included several members from an advisory group that included people from New Zealand. So I don't know if any of you are here today, but again, thank you to you and all of your colleagues who have supported and taught us so much about how to do this work. Next, please. The group is also interested in why metadata creation and metadata itself is changing. So right, as I said earlier, we often are working in a context where the metadata is created by librarians, but now it's coming from a lot of other places. It's getting pushed further up into the scholarly life cycle of when we're creating preprints or data sets even. So now we have publishers, authors, and other parties involved in the creation of this metadata. We may also be including things from crowdsourced enhancements. We've been doing a lot of work and looking at what's going on in sources like Wikidata, and how does that help us better do, name authority and things like that. But that can also be really messy. So sometimes we need to augment what we can do as people with other kinds of algorithms through machine learning and artificial intelligence. I'm certainly not in the camp that believes that this will replace the work that we do, but how do we use it and harness it to enhance our capabilities to do the work better than we already do? And also make this metadata more useful beyond the traditional discovery layer. So a lot of the work that Rebecca's doing is also about how do we use metadata that libraries have expertise in to better understand research impacts outside of the university. And how does this research actually make a difference? Next, please. The metadata managers, in our next session, which will be taking place sometime in 2023, one of the things we're going to be looking at is how do we start moving beyond library-specific controlled vocabularies and including other kinds of things. We're specifically going to be talking about name authorities in that session, but there's also a lot of questions, for thinking about subject headings, and we're limited in how quickly we can adapt some of those to decisions that are made by the Library of Congress. How do we decouple ourselves from LCSH or other kinds of vocabularies that are not being as responsive as necessary? There's a lot of work going on here in the United States. I just came from the ALA Core Forum, where people are trying to find ways to insert rule sets between the MARC records and their discovery layers so that they can represent their communities in ways that the LCSH doesn't allow them to do. And again, this is where looking at how our platforms are able to support this kind of work and moving from MARC to other kinds of linked data as components that would allow us to swap in different vocabularies as appropriate. This, of course, again, requires us building our persistent identifier capabilities up pretty significantly, particularly if we look at beyond names and the literary warrant that allows them to be included in name authorities to include cultural heritage things. So in the United States, we have the Social Networks and Archival Context Project, or again, pulling from Wikidata or other kinds of publication data to be able to represent those authors. And again, in the research practice is the adoption of ORCID and other kinds of persistent identifiers. Next, please. So, this identity management challenge is going to be a big part of what we're doing. And we're moving from making records to describing entities of the resource. So works, people, corporate bodies, places, and events, and then establishing the links and relationships among them. Next. Of course, OCLC and OCLC Research in particular has been a part of realizing the promises of linked data for a long time. This, going back to what Brian was talking about, is all happening because of library cooperation. So applying some of those frameworks that Brian's been talking about, I think is going to be really important in looking at how we move forward. Particularly around how do we not only move forward technically, but how do we build sustainable infrastructures and also apply those appropriately to our partnerships across libraries of all different types, from public libraries all the way to large academic and special collections. Next, please. So that's the other report I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the linked data pilot project that was partly run out of the technical area of OCLC Research. So one of the products that OCLC offers is Content DM. And Content DM is moving more towards a cloud-based structure where all the collections would be readily available to talk to each other, but right now they all live in their own individual silos. Next, please. So in part, looking at this from a user perspective, the project goals sort of were, can we take existing Content DM data and move it and migrate it or reference at least a common linked data model for that information? And then use tools to link that data across all the different Content DM collections that were part of the project and experiment a little with different kinds of platforms like Wikibase, which are built for managing linked data kinds of approaches. So this was first sort of like, I'm going to take the map, the metadata, map it. We're going to build some other tools. And then partly is, can we explore and find new ways of providing interfaces and discovery of these materials once we've got it in a linked data environment. Next, please. Some of the observations that have come out of this report, of course, is something that we all know already, that the source metadata quality is critical to success. Consistency is always vital to being able to crosswalk and move metadata. And that's always been one of the challenges, particularly around double and core metadata and Content DM. So one of the things that we also looked at in this project is, what are the kind of new tools that you need to do it? How do I identify a whole bunch of basically text strings and double and core records across multiple different double and core or Content DM collections? And if you're using things like Wikidata or other large scale vocabularies, do those fit with highly localized materials? So reconciling the text to those entities that are available requires new and dedicated infrastructure that we don't currently have in the Content DM platform. But we did find that if we put the effort into doing that, it can really help improve the quality of the item descriptions and also emphasize interinstitutional sharing and collaboration. So the photograph that's a little bit trimmed off here is an example of something in the report where now I can find similar topics across multiple different collections that are in Content DM because the process of linking them to a linked data property allowed those to be discoverable in ways that they weren't before. So people may have been using different string vocabularies, but the concepts were the same, and now they're united. And the testbed interface allows you to navigate among and between all those different collections. Next, please. The other major area that OCLC is involved with is WorldCat Entities, which was a project that started in research and has now matured over into a product of its own that will continue to see work over the next couple of years. In part, right now, we've published and made this available. And next slide, please. But what will be coming is a partner phase to bring people in to help build other products around this. So right now there is a pilot project for how we internally manage and edit all the OCLC entities called Meridian. That is something that we'll be bringing to OCLC partners to both directly to help them contribute to what new entities need to be made. But of course, there's also always the problem of deduplicating or identifying and disambiguating entities that are already there. So look forward to seeing the results of that work in the future. And again, there's more information about all of our linked data activities at the URL that's there. I think this is my last slide. So that's my information, and happy to reach out to people, and also happy to learn if people are interested in participating as we start reactivating the metadata managers group to continue exploring these topics.
Great, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Brian and Merrilee. This has been really fascinating to hear. I have already written down the links to some of the resources from all your slides to go in and have a look later on. I have posted one question, and I can see Brian has responded. It's really really inspiring to hear, especially about the collaborations. But I'd like to ask both Richard and Brian to tell us a little bit more about Data Curation Network, because I believe this is the first time I'm hearing about it, and I've just looked at their website and it looks absolutely very interesting. I can see some really big universities there joining the collaboration in the network. So could you tell us a little bit about that? And I do understand that OCLC does work with the network too.
Yeah, well, the Data Curation Network actually started with a group of colleagues from different institutions, different universities in the US, who met at a conference, and they were talking, and they identified a shared problem, which is that research data sets coming into repositories are often in a wide variety of formats, and each of those formats requires different kinds of expertise to manage them. And no single institution really can afford realistically to have all of that expertise on hand locally. However, if people pool together their expertise in a network of institutions, then an institution can call on a partner and expertise at that institution to help them with a data set that comes in that they can't handle. And that was really the problem that defined the Data Curation Network. So it got started, they got a grant, they developed it, they brought in more partners, and it's really expanded. I mean, that's still sort of their main function, to have this network of expertise, but it's really expanded a bit beyond that, where I think it's also become sort of a peer network of colleagues working in research data management. It's a forum, it's a platform for exchanging ideas, sharing challenges, and hopefully coming up with shared solutions. I like that example so much because it's a collaboration that sort of sprung out of thin air to deal with an emerging issue, an emerging challenge for academic libraries, which is research data management. Often, as libraries move forward, there's all sorts of new challenges that they need to face, new kinds of services, new kinds of capacities that they need to add to their portfolio. And sometimes it's more than one single institution can handle on its own. And here is a nice example, I think, of institutions banding together to solve a problem that they all share through a collaborative arrangement. So yeah, that's the Data Curation Network.
Thank you, Brian. We feel that through these sessions, especially organized by TELSIG, we get quite a few specialists, posting questions more to each other, asking for advice. How did you do this, and what do you do with this? Especially for highly specialized work that they do. And there's only a handful of people involved in those type of projects. So it seems that here in New Zealand there is a great need, especially for those similar types of collaborations and networks and funding to basically keep those running too. We already have some really excellent examples here, but I believe that research data network is one of the things where actually, we could really pick that up as an excellent example of something we could do here in New Zealand too. So I'd just like to see if we're about 1 minute to end of the session time. Just a quick, are there any questions, other questions coming from the audience at this stage? Now's your chance. If you post your questions, perhaps maybe we won't have time to answer it, but then we could perhaps post it through the Libraries Connect or our Facebook profile, and also email them to Richard and Brian as well. Good. Okay, well, while you're thinking about it, I would really like to thank our guests today, Merrilee especially. It's been a huge pleasure, and it's been absolutely valuable to us to hear the updates, especially resources you shared with us, and the research reports that we can all follow up on and look at as well. And we look forward to hearing from you, another update perhaps in the next year as well. And I do like Merrilee's suggestion that we do this twice a year, perhaps, as an update, which would be excellent. Another example of a collaboration with OCLC and library and inter-organizational collaboration. So I'm going to end the session with a closing karakia, and I wish you all a wonderful evening in US and California as well, and hope to see you soon again next year, perhaps. Okay, so here it is. Whakanoa I tēnei wāhi, whakanoa I tēnei kōrero, whakanoa I tēnei tangata, haumie huie taiki. Thank you, everyone. It's been a great pleasure, and see you again. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.